China's moon program is already decades ahead of NASA, and you're only just starting to notice. While you're watching delayed launches and shifting timelines, China has already completed missions that travel nearly 238,000 miles to the moon and back. That's like circling the Earth almost 10 times. You heard that right. But this isn't about distance, it's about direction. Because one side is building a permanent system, and the other is still assembling the pieces. And the moment you see how differently this race is being run, everything changes. You start by realizing you've been measuring the wrong competition. Wrong race entirely. You've been told this is a race back to the moon, a modern version of Apollo. First to land wins. First to plant a flag takes the headline. And at first glance, that story feels familiar, almost comforting. You track launch dates, delays, test flights. You compare who gets there first. It all seems straightforward. But that's exactly where you fall into the trap. Because while you're watching launches, China is building a system. You see a mission, they see a sequence. You see a landing, they see infrastructure. And that difference changes everything. At first, it doesn't look obvious. NASA's Artemis program sounds massive rockets, astronauts, international partnerships. It feels like momentum. It feels like scale. And for a moment, you assume that scale equals progress. But then something doesn't add up. The timelines stretch, missions shift, components depend on each other in ways that slow everything down. And it's not because the engineers don't know what they're doing. It's because the system itself is complex, distributed across multiple organizations, each building a different piece of the puzzle. And the more pieces you add, the harder it becomes to move fast. But China isn't playing that game. Instead of building separate pieces and trying to integrate them later, they're designing everything as part of one continuous plan. Every mission is intentional. Every step unlocks the next. There's no rush to impress you with a single moment, because they're not aiming for a moment at all. They're aiming for permanence. And that's when the realization hits you. This isn't a race to the moon. It's a race to stay there. Suddenly, the question changes. It's no longer who lands first. It's who builds the first system that can survive, operate, and expand without starting over every time. And when you ask that question, the gap starts to appear. Because landing once is hard, but building something that keeps working power systems, communication networks, repeat missions, that's an entirely different level of engineering. That requires consistency, coordination, long-term thinking. NASA is trying to assemble that capability piece by piece. China is building it as one machine. And the more you look at it, the more uncomfortable the comparison becomes. Because one approach depends on everything going right at the same time. The other is designed to keep moving forward, even if individual steps fail. But this was just the beginning of the difference. Because once you zoom in on how China is actually executing its plan, you start to see why this isn't just faster, it's fundamentally more controlled. And that's where the gap really starts to widen. You start by looking at the roadmap China has been following all along. China's silent blueprint. At first, China's moon missions look disconnected. A lander here, a rover there, a sample return mission that grabs headlines for a moment, and then disappears from the conversation. You don't immediately see the pattern. But that's exactly the point. Because while it looks quiet on the surface, underneath it is one of the most structured space programs ever executed. Every mission you've seen Chang'e 3, 4, 5 was never meant to stand alone. They were rehearsals, carefully staged steps in a much larger sequence. You just weren't meant to notice the sequence yet. It starts with mapping, orbiters scanning every inch of the lunar surface, identifying landing zones, resources, terrain risks. Then come precision landings. China doesn't just land once, it practices landing repeatedly, even on the far side of the moon where communication is harder. That's not a publicity stunt. That's systems validation under constraint. Then comes sample return. And this is where things quietly escalate. Chang'e 5 doesn't just land, it drills, collects material, launches back into lunar orbit, docks autonomously, and returns to Earth. That's multiple mission phases executed in a single chain, nearly 240,000 miles away. That's not one technology, that's an entire ecosystem working together. You heard that right. And here's what makes it different. Each of those steps directly feeds the next mission. There's no reset, no redesign from scratch, just iteration. But this was just the beginning. Because the upcoming missions, Chang'e 6, 7, 8, aren't about proving capability anymore. They're about assembling infrastructure, testing resource extraction, experimenting with in-situ construction, laying the groundwork for something permanent. And at the center of all of it is a single destination, the International Lunar Research Station. Not a concept, not a proposal, a construction plan. And suddenly, everything you thought were isolated missions snap into focus as parts of a single machine. But the moment you compare that to how NASA is approaching the same goal, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. You start to see a very different kind of system taking shape. Artemis under pressure. When you look at NASA's Artemis program, it feels powerful. There's no shortage of ambition. Massive rockets, deep space capsules, international cooperation. On paper, it looks like the most advanced lunar program ever assembled. And in many ways, it is. But then you look closer, and the complexity starts to reveal itself. The Space Launch System, the Orion capsule, the Human Landing System, the Lunar Gateway. Each one is being developed by different teams, different contractors, sometimes even different countries. Each one has its own timeline, its own constraints, its own delays. Individually, they are engineering achievements. But together, they create friction, because none of these systems can fully operate without the others. If one slips, everything shifts. If one changes, integration becomes harder. Progress isn't just about building, it's about aligning. And alignment is slow. You start to notice something else. NASA isn't just building hardware, it's managing relationships, contracts, reviews, safety certifications, political expectations. Every decision carries layers of oversight. Every change ripples across the system. And it's not that this approach is wrong. It's that it's heavy. And in a race where speed compounds over time, that weight starts to matter. But this was just the surface-level problem. Because the deeper issue isn't just delays, it's dependency. NASA's architecture depends on multiple systems working together at the exact right moment. A delay in one doesn't just pause progress, it stalls the entire mission chain. And the more ambitious the system becomes, the more fragile that coordination gets. Meanwhile, China doesn't have to coordinate across that many independent pieces. And that difference is about to become critical. Because once you step into the engineering philosophy behind both programs, you realize they're not just building differently, they're thinking differently. Two engineering mindsets. At its core, this isn't just a space race. It's a clash of engineering philosophies. On one side, you have a system built on integration. On the other, a system built on coordination. And while they might sound similar, in practice, they lead to completely different outcomes. China designs its missions as a single unified stack. The rocket, the lander, the payload, the communication systems, they're all developed with each other in mind from the very beginning. Fewer interfaces, fewer unknowns, fewer points where something can break. You're not stitching pieces together later. You're building them to fit from day one. NASA, on the other hand, operates differently. It distributes development across specialized teams. One builds the rocket, another builds the capsule, another builds the landing system. Each one pushes innovation in its own domain. And that creates flexibility, arguably the best technology in each category. But then comes the hardest part, making all of it work together. Because every interface between systems becomes a risk. Data connections, physical docking, software compatibility, timing, testing, certification. Each boundary introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty slows you down. You start to see the trade-off. China sacrifices some flexibility for speed and cohesion. NASA gains flexibility, but pays for it in complexity. And in deep space systems, complexity compounds fast. But here's where it becomes uncomfortable. Because complexity doesn't just slow development, it limits iteration. If your system is tightly integrated, you can test, adjust, and relaunch quickly. But if your system depends on multiple independent components, iteration becomes harder. Changes ripple outward. Testing takes longer, timelines stretch. And suddenly, one program is learning faster than the other. That's the part most people miss. This isn't just about who builds better technology. It's about who learns faster over time. And once that gap starts to open, it doesn't stay small. But the real acceleration isn't happening in design alone. It's happening in how fast each system can actually move from one mission to the next. And that's where things start to escalate. Speed changes everything. At first, it doesn't look like a problem. A launch gets delayed. A test runs longer than expected. A system needs another round of validation. You've seen this before, and it feels normal. Space is difficult. Precision takes time. Nothing about that surprises you. But then the delays stop being isolated. They start connecting. One mission slipping begins to affect the next. A dependency shifts, and suddenly an entire sequence has to be adjusted. Hardware sits waiting. Teams pause for integration. And what once looked like steady progress begins to stretch out into something slower, heavier. You're still moving forward, but you're no longer building momentum. And that's where things start to change. Because in a race like this, time isn't just a schedule. It's an advantage. Every extra month isn't neutral. It's an opportunity for the other side to move again, to test something new, to refine a design, to push one step further ahead while you're still aligning the previous step. And that gap doesn't stay small for long. Because China isn't slowing down between missions. It's accelerating through them. You start to notice a pattern. Missions aren't spaced far apart. They're sequenced tightly. A success doesn't lead to a long pause. It leads directly into the next objective. Systems aren't being redesigned from scratch each time. They're being refined, adjusted, reused. That's iteration. And iteration changes everything. Because when you shorten the time between attempts, you increase the rate of learning. Mistakes are identified faster. Improvements are implemented sooner. Knowledge doesn't fade between missions, it compounds. And once that cycle stabilizes, progress stops being linear. It starts to multiply. But this was just the beginning of the advantage. Because iteration alone isn't enough. You also need the ability to build at scale. And this is where the difference becomes impossible to ignore. China's approach keeps its manufacturing pipelines active. Rockets, landers, components, they're not one-off builds. They're part of a continuous production flow. Teams don't disband after a mission. Facilities don't sit idle. The system keeps running. That consistency matters more than you think. Because when production stays active, quality improves, costs stabilize, timelines shrink. You're no longer reinventing the process each time you're optimizing it. And that's when something subtle but powerful starts to happen. Speed becomes predictable. You're not hoping the next mission works. You're expecting it to. But the silence didn't last. Because on the other side, the structure tells a different story. NASA isn't lacking capability. Its engineering is among the most advanced on Earth, but its system isn't built for rapid iteration. It's built for precision, oversight, and coordination across multiple independent players. And that creates drag. Every component moves on its own timeline. Every update requires alignment. Every test feeds into a larger review process. Progress happens, but it moves through layers. And layers take time. You start to see the real issue. It's not that NASA is slow. It's that its speed is constrained. Changes ripple across contractors. Adjustments require renegotiation. Certification processes extend timelines. And when everything depends on everything else, moving faster becomes harder, not easier. But this was just the surface-level tension. Because the deeper problem isn't delay. It's accumulation. China's faster cycles mean more data, sooner, more testing, more refinement, more confidence. Each mission strengthens the next. Each success reduces uncertainty. Meanwhile, longer cycles mean fewer chances to learn in the same amount of time. And over years, that difference becomes massive. You're not just comparing two programs anymore. You're comparing two rates of evolution. One is learning in tight, continuous loops. The other is learning in wider, slower intervals. And once that gap opens, it doesn't close easily. Because the faster system isn't just ahead. It's improving faster than you can catch up. And it wasn't just about launching more often. Because the real shift happens when that speed starts to shape what's being built on the moon itself. That's when the race stops being about movement and starts becoming about control. Building the moon. Up to this point, you've been thinking in missions. Launch, land, return, repeat. That's how space has always been framed for you. Contained events with a clear beginning and end. Even the most advanced programs follow that rhythm. You go, you do the job, you come back, and then you start over. But that model is already breaking. Because China isn't planning missions anymore. It's planning construction, and that changes the entire meaning of this race. At the center of it all is the International Lunar Research Station. And if you imagine a small outpost with a few astronauts, you're still thinking too small. Because this isn't a base. It's a system. Power grids that don't shut down when the lunar night hits. Communication relays that keep everything connected, even on the far side. Autonomous machines that don't wait for human instructions. Resource extraction systems designed to turn lunar soil into usable materials. This isn't exploration. It's industrialization. And the moment that clicks, everything you've seen before starts to feel outdated. But this was just the surface of the plan. Because the real shift isn't what they're building, it's how they're building it. Instead of waiting for humans to arrive and assemble everything manually, China is designing a system that can begin construction before astronauts ever set foot there. Robotic missions that prepare landing zones. Machines that test excavation. Systems that validate energy generation and storage. Each mission doesn't just prove a concept. It leaves something behind. And that's the part most people miss. Because every time a mission ends, something remains. Data, hardware, capability, progress that doesn't disappear when the spacecraft leaves. The moon slowly transforms not in a single leap, but in layers. But the silence didn't last. Because once that process begins, it becomes self-reinforcing. You're no longer sending missions into an empty environment. You're sending them into a place that already has infrastructure. Power systems can support new equipment. Communication networks reduce risk. Landing zones become more predictable. And suddenly, every future mission becomes easier than the last. That's how you build momentum off-world. Not by doing something once, but by making sure the next attempt starts further ahead. Meanwhile, NASA talks about sustainability. And to be fair, it's part of the Artemis vision. Long-term presence, habitats, resource utilization. The same ideas exist on paper. But the execution tells a different story. Because Artemis still operates mission by mission. One launch depends on another. One system waits for the next. Infrastructure is discussed, but not yet layered into a continuous build sequence. You're still seeing plans for staying, but not a system that guarantees it. And that gap starts to widen. Because building infrastructure isn't just about technology. It's about commitment. You have to decide early on that you're not leaving. And once you make that decision, everything changes. Design choices shift. Missions become interconnected. Redundancy is built in. Scalability becomes a priority. You stop optimizing for success and start optimizing for permanence. China made that decision, and now every step they take reflects it. But here's where it gets even more serious. Because once infrastructure exists on the moon, it does more than support missions. It creates leverage. Control over landing zones, control over resources, control over logistics. If you have power systems in place, others can plug into them or struggle without them. If you control communication networks, you shape how operations happen across the surface. And just like that, the moon stops being neutral ground. It becomes an environment shaped by whoever builds first. You start to realize this isn't just about exploration anymore. It's about presence. And presence changes the rules. Because the first system that proves it can operate continuously, generate power, sustain operations, support expansion, that system becomes the foundation others have to work around. Not because it's declared the winner, but because it's already there. And it wasn't just about technology anymore. Because once one side begins turning the moon into a working environment, the other side isn't just catching up. It's adapting to a reality that's already been established. And that's where the race stops looking even. Because the final question isn't who gets there first. It's who makes it impossible for others to compete on equal ground. And that answer is starting to take shape. Who controls the moon? You've been thinking about this as a race. Two nations, two programs, two timelines moving toward the same destination. You compare launches, technologies, delays. You try to figure out who's ahead. But that framing misses the real shift entirely. Because this was never just a race to reach the moon. It's a race to control what happens after you arrive. And control doesn't come from a single landing. It comes from everything that follows. At first, that idea feels abstract. The moon seems too distant, too empty, to control in any meaningful way. There are no borders, no cities, no permanent presence yet. But that's exactly why this moment matters. Because the first system that turns the moon into an operational environment sets the rules for everyone else. And that's already starting to take shape. You begin to see it through infrastructure. Not flags, not footprints, systems. Power grids that determine where activity is possible. Communication networks that define how data flows. Landing zones that become standardized because they're already prepared, already tested, already integrated into a larger system. And once those pieces exist, they do something subtle but powerful. They create dependency. Because any future mission, no matter where it comes from, has a choice. Build everything from scratch in isolation, or connect to what's already there. And connecting is always easier. But this was just the beginning of the shift. Because dependency leads to influence. If one system provides power, others rely on it. If one network handles communication, others operate through it. If one infrastructure supports logistics, it begins to shape how missions are planned, executed, and expanded. Not through force, through necessity. And that's when you realize something bigger is happening. The moon isn't just becoming a destination. It's becoming an ecosystem. And ecosystems don't stay neutral for long. They organize around whatever structure emerges first. That structure defines standards. It defines access. It defines the pace of expansion. And once it's established, changing it becomes incredibly difficult. You don't just build alongside it. You build within it. But the silence didn't last. Because on the surface, it still looks like NASA is in the race. Artemis is moving forward. Missions are planned. Partnerships are growing. The capability is there. And it is. But capability alone doesn't determine control. Consistency does. Because to shape an ecosystem, you don't need one breakthrough. You need continuity. You need systems that don't reset after each mission. Infrastructure that grows instead of disappearing. A presence that doesn't depend on perfect timing or synchronized components. And that's where the gap becomes undeniable. China isn't just preparing to land. It's preparing to remain. Step by step, mission by mission, it's laying down the pieces of something that doesn't go away, power that stays, systems that expand, operations that become routine instead of exceptional. And once that threshold is crossed, everything changes. Because the first time a system operates continuously on the moon, without interruption, without reset, it stops being an experiment. It becomes reality. And reality is hard to compete with. You can plan for it, you can respond to it, but you can't ignore it. Because from that point on, every new mission isn't entering empty space. It's entering someone else's environment. And that environment comes with constraints. Predefined landing corridors, established communication protocols, existing infrastructure that either helps you or forces you to work around it. You're no longer shaping the landscape. You're navigating it. And that's the moment the race quietly ends. Not with a headline, not with a single mission, but with a shift in control. And it wasn't just about the moon anymore. Because once a stable, scalable system exists there, it becomes a staging ground for everything beyond it. Mars missions, deep space logistics, resource pipelines. The moon stops being the goal and starts becoming the foundation. And whoever controls that foundation doesn't just lead one race. They define the next ones. You start to see how far this reaches. This isn't about prestige. It's about positioning. Because the first nation to build a working, expandable system beyond Earth isn't just ahead in space exploration, it's operating on a different level entirely. While others are still planning missions, it's managing operations. While others are solving individual problems, it's running a continuous system. And catching up to a system is much harder than beating a mission. But this was the part no one wanted to say out loud. Because once that system is established, the race doesn't stay open. It narrows. Opportunities shrink. Options become limited. And late entrants don't get to define the rules, they adapt to them. And suddenly, the question you started with who's ahead doesn't even matter anymore. Because ahead implies you can catch up. This isn't about being ahead. It's about being first to build something that others can't easily replace. And if you've been paying attention, you already know which direction this is going. Because while you were watching launches, comparing timelines, waiting for the next big milestone, one side was quietly doing something else entirely. It was building the future of the moon piece by piece. And by the time the world fully understands what's been created, it won't feel like a race at all. It will feel like arrival.